Now let's back up and look at these verses piece by piece. First of all, under the section, Paul's own hand. He says, see with what large letters. In the Greek, it's the word gramma. You know what grammatical is, or grammar. See with what large letters I've written to you in my own hand. Now, who knows, what is the longest letter of Paul? I'll tell you a trick. If you want to know what letters are longer of Paul, they're placed in the Bible in order of their length. So what is the first letter of Paul in the Bible? After the book of Acts, you've got Romans, then 1 Corinthians. What follows 1 Corinthians? Quick. 2 Corinthians. Very good. I knew you'd get that one. Romans is longer than 1 Corinthians. Don't go by the chapters, go by the amount of words, because when they divided them, they didn't even have chapters and verses. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. So where does Galatians on that continuum? Is that his longest book? So when he says, see with what large letters I've written to you, he's not talking about the length of the letters. He's actually talking about the size of the characters. The letters were written largely. Now, why is this? You'll notice in your lesson, it talks about the thorn in Paul's side. I'm going to read 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9, talking about the thorn in Paul's flesh. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing that he doesn't name specifically, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I'd rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ might rest upon me. Now, just before we get to that, what is this thorn in his flesh? First of all, I think it's very, 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 very important for us to notice Paul, Spirit-filled apostle, prayed for people, laid hands on them, they were healed. He's got some physical ailment he prays about, and it's not healed. Someone might have said to Paul, physician, heal thyself. And he prayed 3 times. Why not? Does that mean that he didn't have enough faith? Have you heard churches say before that if you've got enough faith, God will heal anything? I do believe in biblical healing. We did an anointing this week, and I'm praying and believing in healing. But sometimes God says no. And typically, even if you take care of yourself, you live long enough, you're going to get sick and die. I mean, Elisha the prophet was a mighty prophet. It was through Elisha that Naaman was healed of his leprosy. But then you read in the Bible that he got a sickness and finally died from it. And so people do get sick and die. And it doesn't mean you don't have faith. God does not heal every sickness. What Jesus did when he went through towns and healed everybody was a little different. The apostles also did healing, but sometimes God says, no, you've got this ailment because it'll keep you humble, because you've had so many revelations. Paul, you've seen heaven open. You saw Jesus. You've had revelations of truth. And, just to keep you in check, to avoid you being proud, I'm going to let this thing stay. God has often done great ministry through people that had physical ailments. God often accomplishes great things with people who may have some kind of physical ailment or something. Amazing Facts was started by Joe Cruz largely, and maybe you've noticed Joe Cruz had polio in one arm, but it didn't prevent him from holding the Bible in his other arm. And the man who wrote the Amazing Facts lessons, Bill May, was in such tremendous pain, he told me he wrote most of the Revelation Seminar study guides and the Amazing Facts study guides on his knees because he couldn't sit. And so, sometimes God has to humble people. I've got hay fever, so I'll pray for me. Now, there's a lot of speculation about what was Paul's thorn. I suspect, as many other commentators do, that it was his eyesight. Some say it was epilepsy. I think it's important that you don't fall for that, because the ones who say it was epilepsy also say It was during an epileptic fit that he had a vision of Christ. And he didn't really see Christ, it was epilepsy. So I think it's important to understand what this probably was.
Acts 9, verse 8 and 9. Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank.
After Jacob wrestled with the angel, did Jacob survive that wrestling match? Was he blessed at the end of that wrestling match? Did he limp the rest of his life after that wrestling match? Did Israel grow into a nation even while Jacob limped? Even though Paul was struck blind from the vision of Christ, it tells us that he was, and by the way, if we read verse 18, Acts 9:18, after Ananias came and prayed for him, it says, and there fell from his eyes something like scales. It's almost like there had been some burn and some cataract fell off his eye, and he received his sight at once. Now, we don't know if he received 20/20 vision. He was able to see again, and if you're totally blind and you can see again, you're happy for a little sight. But Paul may not have been issued a driver's license from that point on. And one reason we say that is because when he writes in Galatians, behold, with what large characters I write, most of Paul's letters were written by other people. Now, he is the most eloquent and educated of all the apostles. He is the most multilingual. He said, I speak with tongues more than you all. That didn't mean he babbled more. It meant that he spoke many different languages. He was born in Tarsus. He also spoke Hebrew. He spoke Latin. He spoke Greek. Probably spoke some of the languages of Asia. He was very well studied. Why was someone always writing his letters for him? Even when he was in prison, you'd have to bring secretaries in to write for him. It's probably because he had problems seeing. It wasn't that he was totally blind, but he had bad vision. Notice 1 Corinthians 16, verse 21. The salutation with my own hand, Paul's. He often finished his letter by saying, I'm going to authorize this letter by writing a line or two in my own handwriting. Again, Colossians 4:18. This salutation by my hand, Paul. Remember my chains, the grace be with you all. That's all he said there, just kind of a blessing. 2 Thessalonians 3:17. The salutation of Paul with my own hand, which is a sign in every epistle. So I write. You know, they even had forgeries back in Paul's day. People would write things and they put it on his letterhead and say, here's a message from Paul. Some apocryphal books that were starting to float around. And to avoid that, Paul would write things in his own hand. And they'd compare his letter with his signature with other signatures he had left with them. And they said, oh, this is Paul's signature. And one of the things that you noted about it was the large characters. I'll read you another verse that makes me believe that it was his eyesight. Acts chapter 23, verse 2, when Paul's arrested and he goes to the high priest, and the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by Paul to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul, I imagine him squinting, and he's looking towards the bench. He said, oh, I didn't know, brethren, he was the high priest. For it's written, you shall not speak evil of the rule of your people. So here he's in a courtroom, and someone commands him to be struck, and he says, oh, I didn't know you were the high priest. It kind of tells you, I mean, he's right there in the room. He can't see very well. All right, go ahead, read for us Galatians 4:15.
Galatians 4:15. What then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me.
Isn't it interesting that he says both in the book of Galatians, I'm writing with big letters, I know you cared so much you would have given me your own eyes. Well, you wouldn't give your eyes to someone that had good eyes of their own, would you? So this and a number of other verses lead us to think Paul had problems with his eyesight. And he almost always traveled with somebody because he needed to be escorted different places. All right, let's go ahead and go onto the section boasting in the flesh.